Alright, students, this is a quick review of time period 1 for you guys to use as you prepare for your quiz. We'll be covering very briefly the content that we've done in the first few weeks of school. So having out your class notebook is a really good idea so that you can flip through and look at any work that you've done that's relevant to the topics that we'll be discussing. We're going to start in the Paleolithic era. And if you look at your learning targets, everybody should have a double-sided sheet that has, I don't know, let's see, several different learning targets, about 2 or 3 big learning targets for each of the eras, or for each of the big issues. And if you have that out, you can see that the Paleolithic era really gets just that first portion of your targets, the ones that are called 1.1, Big Geography and the Peopling of the Earth. And we talked about this a while in class, but didn't focus on it too specifically. It's only a small portion of the AP World History content, and there are a few really big points that we definitely need to hit on to make sure that you know, and then we can kind of move on to the Neolithic era from that. The biggest and most important thing that we talked about in the Paleolithic era were human migrations. After the evolution of modern humans in Africa, we see that humans leave East Africa about 80,000 years ago. And as a class, we talked about humans leaving from around the area of modern Djibouti and crossing the Bab el-Mandeb and going into the Middle East, and from there to all other parts of Eurasia, and then perhaps across a land bridge in the Bering Strait, but also perhaps by boat down the coast of the Americas. We looked at humans' arrivals by boat throughout Southeast Asia and all the way into Australia. And we talked about how humans had done all of this through their amazing adaptability and their ability also to use tools. And specifically, we looked at fire. We talked about using it to clear underbrush, cooking, protection, all sorts of things. All of this was done in a period when humans had only stone tools to work with. You can see an example of one up there in the right-hand corner. That one is quite old. I think that one is in the British Museum, of course, like every other artifact. And I think that one dates really to more like 1,000,000 years. So it actually predates modern humans. All of these people had a nomadic way of life because they were hunting and gathering. They did not produce their food with farming at all. They just constantly moved to follow herds and follow seasonal fruits and grains. And it was also a really marked way of life, or it was a way of life marked very specifically by how egalitarian it was. And that's an important word to know. Egalitarian just means fairly equal. So there wasn't job specialization. Everybody just hunted and gathered. There weren't very many possessions because they had to carry everything on their backs. And women gathered about 70% of the calories that people ate. So they had quite high status, and we see that in a lot of the what we call Venus figurines that show up across Eurasia during this period. There's an example from, I believe, modern Turkey or Anatolia on this slide, and usually these were just pretty rotund ladies. And we think that it was part of the animist religious beliefs of these Paleolithic people. We've got another slide, I think it's next, yeah, that shows some of the artwork that was created in caves by these Paleolithic peoples, maybe somewhere around 20 to 25,000 years ago. You can see the handprints, and then of course that really huge focus on animals and game. So their religion and their culture was really focused around understanding nature and trying to, I guess, manipulate nature perhaps to have better hunting and focus on fertility and food. So that's really what these people were up to, and that way of life lasted for a really, really long time. It was extremely effective, and if you'll remember the Neolithic Revolution lecture, it was an extremely, not just effective way of life, but also fairly healthy as compared with early farmers. Although the human lifespan was still pretty short, humans tended to be quite tall, they had good teeth, they were pretty robust, and they had a wide variety of foods in their diet, so it was a pretty good life. There wasn't any slavery, there wasn't a lot of coercion because there was no central government, so all in all, it was pretty good to be a Paleolithic person. Now, we talked about the Ice Age ending, and that's a really important key thing to understand. The end of the last Ice Age, between about 14 and 11,000 years ago, is really what sparked a large change to the Neolithic Revolution. So, as the climate warmed up, in certain areas of the world, especially Mesopotamia, wild grasses began to flourish. And we all hopefully understand that the natural, or the calories that are just in your environment anyway, tend to dictate how you get your food. So if there happen to be a lot of wild grasses, then you as a human are going to be harvesting those wild grasses to eat. Now, over the course of several thousand years, that focus on wild grasses and the desire of humans to manipulate those wild grasses to perhaps, I don't know, grow in, more abundant stands, or human activity to weed out undesirable plants around those grasses, or the humans' desires to gain more by perhaps planting some wild grasses over a few thousand years actually turns into being dependent on those grains so that people settle down. And that dependency doesn't really happen overnight, obviously. It's not like humans woke up one day and said, I will be a farmer. Instead, over time, the ability to get calories from that grain became so predominant that it was only natural to harvest it, store it, and then stay near it and protect it. And that is what we think happened in Mesopotamia around about 10,000 years ago, when we start to see the first villages appear. Mesopotamia was lucky because they also had a lot of really awesome domesticatable animals that were present naturally in the environment. Things like goats and sheep and pigs and cattle were in Mesopotamia anyway. The wild versions were. And what humans were able to do in Mesopotamia very uniquely is combine the wild wheat, and there were also other things like lentils and things like pulses, which are basically peas. So they have all these good crops, and they have all these awesome animals that won't eat them and will breed where and when they want them to, and they won't run away. And it's very natural that in that area people move toward plant and animal domestication and then farming. And you can see up on the screen a really cool picture of a stone sickle that was actually used to harvest wheat or other crops in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. Over on the right, you can see people milking cows in ancient Egypt. And farming slowly spreads. If you'll remember, we talked about something called the ratchet effect, wherein populations inside of villages grow kind of to a breaking point, at which point smaller groups of humans need to leave the village, migrate, and found their own area of farming somewhere nearby, so farming naturally spreads. In addition, hunters and gatherers perhaps picked up on some of these farming techniques, maybe because the farmers were kind of out-competing the hunter-gatherers in terms of their ability to have military forces because their population was bigger. So there are all kinds of changes that just sort of occur over the course of a few thousand years in and around Mesopotamia. They spread into Egypt, they spread into other areas around the Tigris and Euphrates. And we can see all these different areas on this map. I'm going to focus on a few though. On the far right, we see China. China began to have villages and settled sedentary agricultural farming a little bit after Mesopotamia, but within about 1,000 years of Mesopotamian farming, we start to see villages appear in China. And China was growing a lot of the same things. They had a lot of the same advantages in which there were convenient crops and convenient animals already present. They just needed to be domesticated, and they were in fact domesticatable. In Mesopotamia, you can see there was wheat, barley, lentils, goats, pigs, and cows, all kinds of good stuff. Over in Africa, you can see another big initial area of domestication that was done independently. This was focused on millet, which is a grain, and then yams. And there was also cattle present. And these groups were mostly Bantu groups. They spoke a language group called Bantu, and they spread throughout sub-Saharan Africa, taking with them all those very useful agricultural domesticated plants and animals. Over in the Andes Mountains of South America, the potato and the llama were both domesticated. And in Mesoamerica, maize, the turkey, and the guinea pig were all domesticated. And if you'll remember, maize was extremely difficult to domesticate. Remember, there were pictures of little tiny corn that was slowly domesticated into the corn cob that we know today. You can buy at, Kroger and eat with your summer barbecue. So that crop was particularly difficult to domesticate, which is why Mesoamerican civilization gets started at a significantly later date than, for example, Mesopotamian agriculture, which gets started very, very early. All right. The lifestyle of the Neolithic period lasts for several thousand years, and it's focused on villages. It's definitely sedentary. Possessions start to be accumulated, and people need to live near the grain that they've stored. We start to see pottery. This pot that's on the screen right here is about 4,000 years old, and we find it in what was known as Shang Dynasty China. We start to see some hierarchy emerge. These were mostly chiefs or kind of low-level leaders that maybe led a village or several villages. And that hierarchy and their position in leadership was mostly dependent on their actual ability. It was about charisma and power rather than like inherited wealth, which will come later. If you'll recall, we had a good conversation about how males passed down their position of power and privilege to their sons if they were a part of the nobility. And that kind of passing down of your leadership role doesn't really exist yet in this period, mostly because people needed to really be good leaders in order to keep their position. Women's position begins to fall off. Calorie acquisition starts to develop around farming. Farming involves really heavy labor, especially the very heavy labor associated with creating really big irrigation networks. And then we also see these big storage granaries start to develop. And over time, the hypothesis is that these storage granaries begin to turn into the temple complexes that we see in later civilization where we get real cities. We also discussed another really effective life way. Again, this is very dependent on your environment. If you happen to live, in the Arctic tundra, then you're not going to be a farmer. You're probably going to be a pastoralist. If you live in a grassland like these guys here, these are the Mongols. They've got camels. Actually, these are camels called Bactrian camels. They have 2 humps, and they're kind of furry. And Herders always live in grasslands because animals eat grass. They domesticate animals. It's a very effective way of living. They can use the milk, meat, wool, all that kind of stuff from their um, animals to have a really good economy and have a good way of life. You should have a chart inside your notebook that compares nomadic and quote civilized people, settled people. So make sure that you look over that chart and that you know the differences between those two kinds of lifeways and why those lifeways existed in different places. If you happen to live in a river valley with wild wheat and wild goats, then you're probably going to become a farmer. But if you live in a grassland, and there are little furry ponies running around, you'll probably just domesticate those little furry ponies and make your living off of herding those rather than settling down at your non-existent river with your non-existent wild wheat and your, complete inability to have irrigation or anything like that. So again, it's all dependent on environment. Okay, after a few thousand years of village life, you start to see the first cities. Remember, civilization refers to people living in cities. You should have a piece of paper in your notebook called the Civilization's Paradigm, perhaps, and those are a listing of really common characteristics that we see across nearly every single Bronze Age civilization. There are a couple exceptions. For example, civilizations in the Americas usually are not formed around a river. That's quite unusual. And not all civilizations develop writing as we think of writing. The civilization called the Chavin up in the Andes Mountains never develops writing like we think of it. Instead, they have the knotted strings, the different colorful woolen strings called kipu. Civilization. John Green talked about this in his video. It's a really loaded term. It assumes that the people who are, quote, civilized are better. And so we have to be careful when we use the phrase civilization, because really it just means that you live in a city. Although over time it's kind of taken on a connotation that the civilized people are somehow better than people who don't live in cities. But as we just talked about, living in a city or not living in a city pretty much just has to do with what naturally occurs in your environment and the way that you can naturally fulfill your needs best. So in some places that's through farming, and in some places it's not. Now, the thing that you have to have a city is, of course, agricultural surplus. So in river valleys like Mesopotamia, you get the ability to have an agricultural surplus, and suddenly all sorts of cool things start to appear, like job specialization and rulers that oversee huge irrigation networks, etc. Strayer proposed the idea of the cooperation and leadership needed for irrigation as a prime reason for the appearance of civilizations rather than just villages. It could also just have to do simply with population growth. And as the population grew and grew and grew, there was more pressure to produce more agricultural surplus, which caused a need for more organization and things like irrigation works that would push the surplus up higher. As all of this takes place, coercion by the state starts to become more apparent and oppressive. You get things like militaries or bureaucrats that enforce the taking of a portion of people's grain in the form of taxes to the granary, which of course later on kind of becomes the temple complex. Patriarchy and hierarchy also become more entrenched as people seek to justify their role and position within society. They have to come up with a way to legitimize the reason that they have a higher role. Or for men, they have to be careful that the property that they have now accumulated as a sedentary person is able to be passed down to their actual genetic son. So that's an important thing. And as women become more bound to the home, they're actually able to have more children because they don't they're not a nomad, so they don't constantly have to carry a child around, so they could actually have more than one child who was not a good walker. So you start to see women have more babies and stay kind of closer to the home, and their role becomes more associated with the home. Rulers use all kinds of ingenious methods to justify the reason that they're there. They're very closely linked in Bronze Age civilizations to religion and the gods, whether they say they're the representative of the god on earth, whether they claim to speak for a god or to be put into positions of power by the gods, or, as in Egypt with the pharaoh, actually claim to be a god. They also, of course, have coercion. That's probably the real force behind their power. That's the ability to, use force to make people do what you want them to, especially to pay their taxes in the form of grain. They also use displays of wealth. Think about Ashur-nasir-pal from your summer reading. He was the, I think, Assyrian king who had that big party where he gave all of his 10,000 best friends wine and other luxury food and drink goods that kind of created loyalty amongst them. They wanted to be able to share in his wealth and in his, I guess, awesome parties. So his 10,000 closest friends all got together, and he was able to create loyalty by displaying that wealth and sharing that wealth with them. And then, of course, appealing to people. We read a portion of Hammurabi's law code that speaks very specifically to that. Hammurabi claims to be protecting weak people and causing justice to be done on earth, etc. We've got to know several civilizations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Bantus of West Africa, the Indus River Valley, Shang Dynasty, China, the Olmec, and the Shivin. You've got all of these listed with some details on your Prezi notes, and you've also read about them in your Strayer text. So go back, make sure that you feel comfortable, that you know at least a few details for each of those. And then remember what we talked about in terms of rising levels of centralization and complexity. We talked about villages in the early Neolithic period that gave way to city-states, which was just a city and its surrounding agricultural land. Eventually, one city-state would become very strong and perhaps conquer a few surrounding city-states. That new political entity would be called a state, and there would be basically several city-states, and over the governing of those city-states would be one central government. Eventually, and we'll talk about this more in time period 2, you will have some states which become very strong, conquer other states, and become empires, which implies a lot of diversity because they've become so big that there's different people groups, different ethnic groups, different language groups, different religions, different kinds of people all within one empire. We also looked at 2 different specific interactions that appear on the College Board's curriculum. They are in your learning targets. Let's see, I think it's learning target 1.3, 3F. So 1.3, 3F is all about interactions. You've got to know about these specific interactions. There's the Indus River Valley. You can see their signature seals on the left. They traded through the Bab el-Mandeb, up the Red Sea, and all the way to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian signature seals are on the right, and you can see that they're very similar to one another. Although, of course, the Indus River Valley has their own writing system. You can see it there on the seals, although we don't know how to read it, unfortunately. We also talked about Nubia or Kush, which is to the south of Egypt along the Nile. And in class, we looked at some pictures. In Nubia, we looked at a relief, which is like a raised stone picture, and we compared it with a painting from Egypt. It looked really similar. Here I just found some pictures of pyramids in Nubia, and of course showed you the Great Pyramid at Giza to kind of compare it with. You can see that the architecture is very similar. I put a link to a PBS website. I think you can also probably find the documentary on YouTube if you want to watch it and find out more about sub-Saharan African civilization. All right. The final topic that we really covered is early religion. We have a few key words that we need to know, the definitions to animism, monotheism, polytheism. Those are very important. And we talked at least a little bit about each of the following early religions. Hinduism, and we have quite a bit of detail that we need to know about Hinduism, including the caste pyramid and the various titles of different groups within the caste system, like the Brahmin, who are the priests, and the Kshatriya, who are the warriors. We looked very briefly at Zoroastrianism and Judaism, which are both monotheistic religions. And you read about Buddhism within your homework, although we didn't really speak about it much in class. I hope that you were able to catch on that it's sort of a derivative or a critique of early Hinduism, and it has a specific founder, Siddhartha Gautama, who focused on reaching enlightenment by getting rid of desires. And we'll talk more about Buddhism later in the year. We're also looking at a couple of different Chinese philosophies, Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. And you should have some notes about each of those that you took along with a lecture that you watched previously. Finally, we've got some changes in religion over time and some uses of religion. Let's go over the uses first. I think that we've already pretty much talked about this. Religion gets used to legitimize the social hierarchy and the political hierarchy, and to justify the taking of your grain in the form of taxes for the temples. Up at the top on the right-hand corner, you can see a ziggurat from the Mesopotamian city-state of Ur. And you have these huge monumental buildings like ziggurats or like pyramids and temples that really awed people, and they were kind of like elaborate granaries. And the priests, who were the world's first bureaucrats, kind of did their thing within these temples, and that's where grain was actually stored. There are also some changes that we looked at over time in terms of religion. Religion becomes a lot more personal, especially by about the year 500 BCE. We'll be talking more about this later, but around the year 500 BCE, we start to see a particular time period that historians like to call the axial age, kind of implying that it's a pivot around which other things turn. And in the axial age, religion and philosophy become a lot more personal, and people begin to deal with kind of bigger metaphysical issues, the why am I here and what is the purpose of my life kind of questions, rather than just making sacrifices to impersonal gods. We saw this in two different primary sources that we looked at. We looked at a portion of the Rig Veda, which talked about Indra, the thunder wielder, who was just sort of a god who hung out and controlled natural forces. And then we compared it with a portion of the Upanishads, the story about the salty water. The Strayer book that you read talked about the bubble in the glass trying to become one with the air around it. So it's very philosophical, very metaphysical. We also see that there's a lot of interactions among Bronze Age civilizations that really influence the way that people understand religion. Especially we see this in Zoroastrianism, as their sort of monotheism spreads and takes root across the Middle East. The idea of cultures spreading is usually referred to as cultural diffusion. So, for example, Egyptian culture moving to the south to Nubia, or Nubian culture moving to the north into Egypt, that's referred to as cultural diffusion. There's also a term that means the mixing of different cultural ideas, and usually it refers to religion. That's the term syncretism. And syncretism is really the blending of two different belief systems to create kind of a new hybrid. So you see all those sorts of things in these early interactions. That's kind of the end. My suggestion for you all is to utilize your learning targets and go through each of them, see if you can answer each of the sort of big ideas that it presents to you. I would look over your homework or class notes and worksheets through your notebook, kind of get things in order. so that you can use it as a study guide throughout the course of the year. And if you have any questions, please bring them up in class before the quiz. And I think that is it. Let me know again if you have questions. There we go.